Executive Suite with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. Glad to have you with us as always. Today we're going to talk about a company in the biotech world. We always hear that, maybe a lot of us, as a buzzword, but this is a company that's really doing that and doing some very interesting work, and a top researcher known all over the country who works right here in Rhode Island, and that is Dr. Annie De Groot, who is the founder, CEO, and Chief Scientific Officer at EpiVax. Annie, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm excited to talk about this stuff, and I've already warned Dr. De Groot that I was not a great science student, so but I have total faith in her as a teacher to be able to bring me along, and of course bring you along with us. The viewers are smarter than the hosts, of course, but we'll see if I can come along too. So I want to start off, all the work you do, and there's a couple different pieces to where you do your work, has to do with your research, with what you focus on. So let's start there. Can you give us an understanding of what your research encompasses, what you focus on, and sort of what your goals are as you do that?
Sure. Well, we started out at EpiVax in the vaccine space, and vaccines are made out of proteins. And proteins, obviously, we eat them, you know, but we also make medicines out of them. They're kind of in this new field called biologics, meaning they're not small molecules like chemicals or aspirin, but they're actually larger molecules. And proteins have sequences. And in about 1980, I'd say there were a lot of sequences getting into the data space. So if you can kind of think about this, sequencing was becoming routine. And we were able to sequence the genomes of pathogens. So back in the early 80s, we were actually thinking about the possibility of looking at those sequences and figuring out how you could figure out in those sequences what would turn on an immune response in a human being. And I did a lot of research when I was a postdoc, which is right after I got my MD down at National Institutes of Health, and they were using computers to do that.
And these, of course, would be older, not a MacBook Air today.
Oh
these
my
are the
God,
old-fashioned.
these were, bigger computers, yeah. So these were, definitely not MacBook Airs. So I was so intrigued by that. I actually moved my laboratory. I was working in malaria, and I went over to the National Cancer Institute because I wanted to work with a guy named Jay Brzozowski on this computer analysis of protein sequences stuff. It was so cool. So I worked with him for a couple of years, and I learned everything kind of soup to nuts, like how do you look at the sequences, how do you produce the little pieces from the sequences that trigger an immune response, how do you measure that in a mouse, say, for example. And I did all of that work, so I kind of had that background. And then I went to Tufts New England Medical Center, where I was finishing my infectious disease fellowship. And something happened. It's one of those aha moments, right? So I saw an article that was published where they had a protein sequence, and they had highlighted some of the parts of the sequence which are represented as letters. And I realized that I could use Microsoft Word Find to search protein sequences for these features that would trigger an immune response. It was an aha moment because I realized I could take a very simple tool.
I was going to say, that's not, we imagine with some massive,
no, exactly. When I was working at NIH, we had these supercomputers, and we were working on like three-dimensional structures, but this was much simpler. This was just look at the, I always explain it sort of like, a protein is sort of like a chapter in a book, and the book is the actual genome of the bacteria, right? So we can search in that chapter for a specific word that triggers an immune response. And that's something we call epitopes. Those are the little short sequences that are actually 9 letters, amino acids, that we can identify using computer programs that are a little more advanced than Microsoft Word Find now, to actually find out what will trigger an immune response. So
that moment's been kind of key to all the work you've done since, right?
So we literally, when I moved down to Brown University from Tufts, and when I arrived at Brown, there were all these amazing Brown students who were very good at computational stuff, you know. So I had a basic concept, but I had students like Gabe Meister and Bill Jesdale who are, you know, they graduated from Brown, and they enabled me to turn that concept into computer code that we ran on the computer. We published a few articles, people started calling us up, and before we knew it, we were kind of, you know, at this nexus between all that genomic sequence data and turning that into vaccines.
Is that the data? People think of Bill Clinton having the big press conferences in the 90s. We're going to sequence the human genome. Is that where the data came from?
Yeah, it is so cool. So they were sequencing the human genome, but there are a lot of other people. There's this guy named Rob Fleischman. He was a Brown graduate. I got to know him. He worked with Craig Ventnor. So Rob Fleischman was down at what's called the Institute for Genomic Research, cabling computers together so he could sequence pathogen genomes. Wow. And so I started talking to him because he was doing the TB genome, he was doing Helicobacter pylori, which causes stomach cancer, it's an infection. And I said, you know, in fact, one of his articles in Science appeared and I put the genome on my door because I said, we're going to turn that into a vaccine.
So you saw that, and that's, as I say, that's been the core of kind of what you do. You founded EpiVax in 1998. When I think of these biotech startups, I think of them, there's some idea coming out of a lab, they get a bunch of venture capital money, they're around for X number of years, and either they jump into the sky like lightning or they kind of fade out and it doesn't work out. But you've been consistent now, 17 years, still going, doing lots of different things. Is it a different model at EpiVax when we think of those places that come up with some drug and then they're bought by, AstraZeneca or whoever and make a lot of money and then go on? You kind of seem like you have a different model.
You seem to know the biotech world, yeah.
Well, you read it,
Yeah, I mean, so there are different strategies, and we certainly did go out and do the dog and pony show. I got my suit on and I went up to Boston and talked to venture companies. But it turns out that vaccines take a long time, and so we soon learned that unless we had a vaccine in our hands, that those companies weren't going to fund us. So we kind of said, all right, what are we going to do here? And we realized that there were people who needed our services. In fact, before we even spun the company out of Brown University, people were contacting my lab and saying, could you analyze this protein? Could you analyze that protein? And so I did a little experiment with pricing. I said, well, I'll do it for $5,000. Oh, I'll do it for $20,000. I'll do it for, and so
Test the market.
So you can kind of imagine that at a certain point we were like, no, this is a company.
Yeah.
And then there was Michael Lysat, who unfortunately has passed away, was one of the most incredibly visionary scientists at Brown, and he said, you really need to be connected with Slater Biotechnology Fund. They're funding companies to start up. So he got us connected, and we were able to get what's called a Phase 1 award. And the Phase 1 required that I come out of the university and start a company. So we did that. And you know how Rhode Island is. It's like 2 degrees of separation. A friend of a friend was a programmer. And so I hired him, and we actually started working together before we came out. We were very compatible. That's Bill Martin from Cumberland. And so we've been business partners forever since the founding of EpiVax. He does the programming, I'm the immunologist, and we basically run a company that is immunology and informatics for vaccine and biologics design.
Do you have a lot of competition in that space?
We were pretty unique when we started, and I can say that there are actually other people in this space, but we have a unique mix, which is that we are very excited about the science, and that shows. I mean, people recognize the company.
Geeks?
Yeah, we're geeks, we're geeks. That we're very excited about the science, so when people come to us for the service part of the business, they know they're getting the best minds in the business behind that report that they're getting. So they come to us for their protein sequences, we analyze those protein sequences, and we give them everything that we know. As we go along, we learn more and more and more, and we've built on that foundation of knowledge going along, so it's become phenomenal. I mean, it's really exciting to go into work every day.
That's fascinating. Well, we're going to talk much more about that and your other research as well as what you're doing at URI after a break. So stick with us on Executive Suite, talking with Dr. Annie De Groot from EpiVax. See you after the break.
Obviously you do, yeah.
Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi. We're having such a good conversation. We talked right through the commercial break and into joining you back on air. I'm talking with Dr. Annie De Groot. She is the founder, CEO, and CSO, which is Chief Scientific Officer at EpiVax, which is a biotech company. They do, as we're talking about here, vaccine research, other types of research. It's really interesting, and we're talking a lot about that. But that's not the only hat you wear, which is the next thing I wanted to ask you about. You also, as we mentioned before the break, EpiVax founded as a company in 1998. You'd been at Brown. It kind of came out of Brown. And then you kind of spun back into a university, this time URI. This was in 2008 with this creation of the Institute for Immunology and Informatics. You call it I-cubed, right?
Yes,
3
exactly.
I's in the name.
Yeah.
So that, we're used to hearing about academics doing work and then they think a company and they create a company. Not as often. They're working at the company and think, we need an academic component. Why'd you do that?
Well, it was really because, once again, it was success breeds success. So we became very well known in the field of vaccines for helping people design vaccines. And we do that commercially. So we kept on getting people coming to us saying, could you work on malaria? Could you work on Chagas disease? All these kind of strange parasitic infections that are really important pathogens in terms of global health, but they don't have any commercial value. It's not that we didn't want to do them, we just couldn't justify doing them in the company. And
it's a bigger problem, right, in the world, that malaria and things like that aren't always economical. Difficult
to fund, though. So what we decided to do is to, Bill and I, so Bill Martin, who's the founder of EpiVax with me, we felt it was very important that the tools that we had developed over, I think it was up until, that was 10 years, which were really well-validated tools, that they be accessible to people who are working on what we call neglected tropical diseases. So Jeff Seaman, who was then Dean of University of Rhode Island's College for the Environment and Life Sciences, was working with me on a biotech panel at Tech Collective, and he knew that I was a little bit frustrated about just really having to focus on the commercial aspects of the work, and he invited me to come to URI to set up an institute. I was very excited about this. I thought it was a great opportunity, and furthermore, we were very fortunate to be able to be downtown. So we're actually in the biotech program downtown with Greg Pocket and
downtown Providence. People think URI, they're thinking Kingston, but you're in Providence.
We're at the Shepherd Building. I have Mr. Shepherd's office.
Do you?
Yeah, I do.
Little change from him retailing back in the day,
Yeah, so it's very nice to be there. It's very easy. I can walk from one institution to the other, from EpiVax to URI, and I in fact do that. And so it became an opportunity to create an institute where we could work on non-commercial and very important global health projects. That's what we did. 2008, we set it up. 2009, we got a $13 million grant to do that at University of Rhode Island.
Very quick. I remember when that came down from the NIH, and that just founded last year, and they got $13 million.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that grant continued? Was it time limited?
So it helped us set up the institute, and it ran for 5 years. It was initially 12 something, and then it became 13 with some of that ARA funding that came around when the Great Recession happened, the stimulus package. That enabled us to set up the institute, to hire faculty, to hire the technicians, to basically get the machinery in place. And then the second fortunate thing that really happened was that people became interested in the model. It's a very interesting model within URI. It's basically a self-funded institute. We're on soft money, absolutely. Just like a little biotech company within University of Rhode Island, we have no tenure-track faculty. We pay all of our own faculty.
You're basically a startup inside URI.
Exactly. It's a startup for global health purposes within University of Rhode Island. And so that attracted the attention of a researcher at UMass. His name is Alan Rothman. And he was interested in moving from UMass to Providence because of the possibility of setting up his own program. He brought grants, and then he earned, within a couple of years of coming, $20 million in funding.
I think we had Alan on the show after he got that grant.
Oh, right,
actually.
That's right.
Yes.
You did. I remember seeing that.
Yeah.
That was great.
And so I actually didn't know the connection there, though. So we were talking about vaccines, your work on that, and also this world of personalized medicine. Again, people are hearing probably more and more about that. And I know you think one of the newest, coolest things you're working on in that sphere, it relates to cancer. Tell us about that, what you're doing on cancer that you think is really interesting and kind of on the cutting edge.
Well, so several things have happened over the past couple of years in the cancer field. One thing is that whole genome sequencing story has gone from the human genome to pathogen genomes, and now we're sequencing cancer genomes. And people recently realized that what triggers an effective immune response against cancer and clears cancer are the differences in the cancer genome from your human cell proteins. And so when you sequence a cancer genome, you can run that information through our computer programs, and we can pick out what triggers your immune response based on your genetic profile. So it's very exciting. We can now basically take genome sequences from individual patients' cancers and turn that into personalized vaccines. Wow. Now, this is really going forward very quickly. Over the course of the last 12 months, we've had multiple discussions with large companies, well-funded, venture-backed companies that want to work with us. So there's a company in Europe, there's a group in Japan, and there's a company right in Boston. And I'd say that this is going to go forward in the next couple of months.
Now, do you think that, is it something that in the end, it sounds like something that could be very expensive to do for those individual patients. Do you think it will be something attainable for the average person suffering from cancer?
You know, I think that sequencing genomes has come down in cost, so we're now talking about between $1,000 and $10,000 per genome. So that's probably the same cost for a tumor genome, and those costs can come down further, mind you. So then you're talking about running through the computer program. Each vaccine is going to be unique for the patient, so there's a little cost to that. Maybe it's not that expensive. And then actually producing the vaccine is now, there are different methods that are available. You can make peptides or short proteins, you can make RNA, the actual message that we use to turn into protein, you can use that as a vaccine, you can use DNA. So there are methods for producing vaccines that are not that expensive. You put it all together, and of course you have to get the clinical approval and all of that work. A lot of it is paperwork that has to be funded. So I don't know what it's going to cost, but I do know that it's going to be certainly within range of current cancer treatment therapy and potentially a little bit cheaper. And I think, if you want my opinion, more effective.
Wow, that is really interesting. All right, well, we're going to keep talking with Dr. Annie De Groot from EpiVax after another commercial break. When we come back, talking more about why she's in Rhode Island and maybe what state leaders could do to encourage even more companies like this one. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nisi. We are talking this hour about the nexus of science and commerce and research. Fascinating stuff with Dr. Annie De Groot. She's the founder, CEO, and Chief Scientific Officer at EpiVax in Providence. She also runs the, am I going to get it right, the Institute for Immunology and Informatics at the University of Rhode Island. I got it out. All right.
That's right.
I cubed. I want to ask you, I'm curious, you know, politicians around love to talk about biotech. They love companies like yours, life sciences. We know they hope that will be the future of the economy in a lot of ways. At the same time, 45 minutes up the road, you have one of, if not the hottest place in the world for that kind of research with Cambridge and Boston. Is it ever tough for you to be down here in Providence versus do you ever look and say, oh, I wish I was just next to MIT, you know, with all the stuff coming out around there?
Oh, for me, no. Providence is the place to be. You know, we all know that it's wonderful to live in this state. It's a beautiful state to live in. The facilities that we have available here are wonderful. My commute is 8 minutes. Can you imagine that in Boston? No way.
No.
And as you know, I have multiple things that I do. So getting around between University of Rhode Island, the clinic that I work at, my home, it's all within 8 minutes of my house. So I don't think you can get that in Boston. So I think places where people can really flourish require an infrastructure that is beautiful, that makes them happy, and where they can also do all the things that they want to do. Now, what are the issues in Providence and in Rhode Island in terms of biotech industry? I think we need to build the workforce. So I do think that investments at the level of the biotech program at University of Rhode Island, for example, are incredibly important. And I know that the governor is actually now putting into place some incentives for people, for example, to stay in Rhode Island once they finish. So I really love those incentives. You probably know about them, the $7,000 towards your down payment.
Fellowship, yeah, helping with student loans and housing.
There are some other incentives. For example, we know that there's a voucher program that might be coming out where industry like ours might be able to spend money locally. Say we want to do mouse studies at Lifespans. Say we want to do protein production over at Brown. If we spend that money here, the state will actually help us find that money to spend. So I think that the governor has actually identified some key areas where we can reinforce the programs or the biotech programs that are here and build on the foundation that we have. I think that the biggest problem that we have is hiring. So we need to build the education in this state. We need to train people in this state. We need more funding for people who are currently engaged in biotechnology to acquire new skills. That's actually what we need to be investing in right now.
I have to ask, too, the recent closing of NABS, Barrett Brady's genetic startup in Providence. Often I would hear these two companies named together, NABS and EpiVax. They're our golden children. They're the future. They're doing awesome stuff. NABS is gone. Do you think that's a sign of a bigger problem for Providence? Do you think, you know, it's always going to be competitive in this space and you can't read too much into any one company's experience?
No, I don't think that that's a problem for Providence. I think that's a problem with venture-backed companies. I mean, we are not venture-backed, so we have a mixed business model whereby we eat what we kill, is what we always say. You know, we have a service business, we have grants that fund our basic research. And so I think that one of the problems with venture-backed companies is that's a risk. As you mentioned at the beginning of the program, you know, you don't know what the competitive space is going to be, and you may have the technology that, as I heard, might not be quite ready for prime time. So that may have been the issue at NABS. I'm not sure. I do think that, however, I'm not adverse to venture funding, and so one of the things I wanted to mention is that we're presumably, if everything goes right, we will be spinning out another endeavor, this time not to the university, but actually we'll be spinning out most likely a small venture-backed company within Providence to make better biologics in the very near future. Hopefully I'll...
And why, since you have those reservations when it comes to EpiVax, why are you going in that direction if that venture comes together?
Well, so the technology is ready. And, you know, I think that's a very important ingredient, is that you have to make sure that you've got all the validations in place. We've now been working in this space for 17 years, and we know the tools are really good. And over those 17 years, we've accumulated a serious amount of expertise in the biologic space. So if you give me a biologic, I know how to make it better. And that's actually what we're planning to do with this small venture-backed company. And
remind people once more, you talked about at the beginning, when we say biologics, what do we mean exactly?
So biologics are not what we think of as most medicines. They're, you know, when we take aspirin, it's a chemical. It's a chemical entity. Biologics are based on proteins, so they're much larger molecules, and they are actually things that our immune system does recognize. Bacteria have proteins in them, and when we make an immune response to a bacteria, we're making it to that protein in that bacteria. So they're very important in terms of immune response. The biggest problem with some of the biologics on the market right now is that they drive an immune response. So all the expertise that we acquired around vaccines, what are the triggers, what's going to drive an immune response in a person, in a human being, we can apply to biologics. And now we can say, this is going to be a problem, this biologic, let's fix it, let's retool it, let's change the sequence a little bit, let's tweak it so that it works better. And that's what a bio-better is.
Only about 15 seconds left. What are you excited about going forward within your work?
Some of the basic research we're doing to understand why people have immune responses. And we've just recently learned that pathogens use immune camouflage, that's what we're calling it. It's a completely new discovery, never been described before we applied these tools to pathogens. And that is that viruses and bacteria put human-like sequences into their genomes to avoid immune response.
Interesting. So we'll be watching for the research coming out on that from you. Dr. Annie De Groot, a fascinating conversation. Thank you for being with me today.
My pleasure.
She's from EpiVax in Providence, as well as her institute at URI. You can learn more about them online. Thanks for joining us this week, and see you again next week on Executive Suite.